Hello and welcome to this tutorial. My name is George. Today I'm going to talk about creating a countdown animation motion graphics in Blender. So let's get started. So before we start working on this project from scratch, I would like to share with you an overview on the final file. So we have a plane which assigned a particle system of spheres using this sphere here as an instancer. And we have 5 numbers which we're using to alternate the target object here we're using. The method I'm using here is Shrinkwrap modifier assigned to the plane and an animation assigned to the target. So the target goes up and down. When it's down, it switches to the next number and then goes up and back again. I'm using animation nodes to alternate the target here from 5 to 4 to the other numbers. And while the target is up and the plane is shrink wrapped to it, if I go to render mode, you see that we cannot see the spheres that are on the plane. And this plane, even the plane itself, won't show in the render mode, as you notice in the animation that were played in the beginning of this tutorial. So we're going to talk about that at the end, how to make this happen, and how to render the final product to look mostly like this without this gray plane at the bottom, of course. So let's get started. So I'll start a new file. And let me here enable screencast keys so you can see here on the left whatever I'm clicking, shortcuts I'm using. So I will press X to delete the default cube. Make sure that the 3D cursor is in the center of the world. If it's not for some reason, press Shift C and it will be snapped here in the center of the world. So press Shift A, Mesh, Plane. And here we created our plane that we will use for the particle system. So I'll go to edit mode, press tab, and right click while it's selected. If it's not, just press A to select. It's one face practically. Right click and go to subdivide and expand this menu here that shows up. One cut will give us will change the faces here. We had one face, now we have 4, and you can check here on the status bar that we have 4 faces. We need way more than that, so I will go with 19 cuts, and this will give us 400 faces. So 19 cuts practically are giving us on each edge of the plane 20 faces. So 20 by 20 is 400, and that's it. By any chance, if you cannot see this information here on the status bar, just right click on it and enable Scene Statics. Now we have our plane ready. Press tab again to exit to object mode. Let me switch this to the top. So we're in object mode again. And we will need way more than this 400 cuts, but I would like to use a non-destructive pipeline while using Blender as much as I can. And if you'd like to know what's the difference between destructive and non-destructive, let me explain. So I will, while the plane is selected, I will go to the modifier stack, modifier mode here, modifier panel, and add a subdivision surface modifier. Okay, now you notice that we have this chamfered edges, but that's about it. And when we go to edit mode, nothing shows up. But here we can see in object mode that we have now 1600 faces, not 400 faces, because we subdivided each one of the existing faces into 4 smaller faces. Using the subdivision modifier gives us the ability later to change our mind and to crank it up to 2 subdivision levels with 6,400 faces, for instance. Now I know that I will need one level of subdivision because I experimented with this before I made the tutorial. But I changed my mind a lot while creating this tutorial, and having this subdivision modifier saved me from redoing the whole thing all over again. While if I was to subdivide this here, maybe to 6,400 faces inside the edit mode, that will make it much harder to change my mind later and say, no, actually, I want less faces than this. So this is the difference between destructive and non-destructive pipeline in Blender. Blender allows you to work with both pipelines, of course, but eventually I end up using a bit of both, the destructive and the non-destructive. So we have our plane ready right now. We added the subdivision modifier. And another way to add this subdivision modifier, if I delete it now, I just to press Ctrl 1. And 1 means we need one level of subdivision. Let me just bring this. So we have 1 levels in the viewport, but be careful, we have here 2 levels in the render. So if we render this, and now you won't see the difference, but at the end we will have 2 levels of subdivision. So we have 4 times this number here of faces, which is 6,400. So for this tutorial, we're not using the subdivision modifier to smooth the surface. We're using it to decide how many faces we want in the final render. So just make sure that you have both of them, the levels in the viewport and the levels in the render, set to 1 here. Now, next step is to add our instancer, the sphere that we will be using for the particle system. So just make sure that you haven't moved the 3D cursor. And if you did, by pressing Shift right click somewhere, just press again Shift C and it will snap again to the center of the world. Actually, for creating the instancer, we don't need it to be in the center of the world, but I like just to keep things, make sure that everything is in place. So press Shift A, go to Mesh, and click on UV Sphere. Now, this is massive, and I don't want it to be this big, and I have here our menu that we can control. Just make sure that you don't go to edit mode or you change something else aside from navigating, because you will lose the chance to edit this again. So this you can edit here only when you create a new object. Okay, so here I want this, I want half of these. And in Blender, you can do mathematical operations within the input fields. So I want half the segments, I want half the rings, and the radius, I just want it to be 0.1. It won't be this big on the plane, but I just also want it to be large enough to be able to pick it. And we can control the size later, and we can even control it on the level of the particle system itself. So now we have our instancer sphere, and I will just move it somewhere else on the side where we can't see it. So I press G and Shift Z and put it here somewhere. Okay, and I don't like this faceted look, so I will right click and use Shade Smooth. And to keep things clear here in the outliner, because I will be using the outliner to select, I prefer to use other names. Okay, so I will left click here on the plane to select it. I'll press F2 and we'll call it emitter. Sphere, I will just leave it as sphere. It's no big deal. Okay, so now let's assign the sphere to the plane as a particle system. While selecting the plane, I will go here to the particles menu, particles property, and add a new particle system. Now, by default, we have the type of particle system as emitter. We have 2 types in Blender, emitter and hair. Emitter will behave this way. I'll press space to play the animation. And this, by the way, what you see here is halos, not this sphere. We haven't assigned the sphere yet. So emitter will be emitting particles, as the word suggests, from the plane. This is not what we're looking for. What we need here is to stick these particles on the plane itself. So the better method to use this here is hair. And we have these paths here we will go and use the sphere as the instance object. Go to render here, while in the particles properties cell, go to render menu, expand it, and render as object, and we will use the sphere. Okay, we have our spheres now. Few things we need to change. First of all, here by default we have 1000 particles. Okay, and we know that we have for this plane 1600. So we don't have enough particles to use. What I want to do is use for each face one particle. So let's do that, 1600 particles. And they are like randomly scattered around. We don't want that either. So expand the source here inside the emission. Expand the source. We are using faces. We don't want to use vertices or volume. Okay, and we don't want the random order. And here we have particles per face. We want this 0 means automatic. So we want actually one particle per face. And this is what we get. Now, these particles are not 1600. We have overlapping here. These particles are 400 because the particle system, we need to tell it to use the modifier stack. This is for start in order to take into account the subdivision level modifier that we're using here. So we need to enable this use modifier stack. And now we have one particle assigned to each of the faces that we have after applying the subdivision modifier. Now, by any chance, if you created the subdivision level modifier after the particle system, like this, it will also lose effect because the modifier in Blender, it uses top to bottom. So the modifier at the top will affect all the modifiers beneath it, but not the other way around. So just if you did that, just grab this and bring it up on top of the particle system. So every modifier that you want it to affect the particle system, you need to have it on top of the particle system in the modifier stack. And you need this use modifier stack to be enabled under source, under emission in the particle settings. So now we have the right number. We have everything set up to continue with our project. Now let's create the target. So I'll press Shift A and click on text. Press Tab to go into edit mode. Text in edit mode is allows me to edit the text like editing any text in any text editor like Word or Notepad. So I type 5, press Tab again to go back to object mode, then press GZ to bring it up on Z axis. Now I'll press 7 on the numpad to go to top orthographic view. And press G and bring it here, let's say, just eyeball it. Press S to scale it up. And just approximately put it in the center of the plane. Here is good. Now, the animation I'm going to be using for the plane itself is a rotation animation. So I want to make sure that it's always overlapping the target, because if it goes, let's say, if this target is here and I rotate and this target goes out of focus, well, actually I need to bring it even more. So let's say here, here it will not be, we wouldn't have particles. And the whole animation won't look good. So just make sure that you make it big enough to be always overlap whenever the plane is moving. Now I chose the rotation animation. It's up to you actually. You can choose panning, let's say left to right, or panning top to bottom. It's up to you, but in these cases you need to make it like a bigger plane, not just a square. So now we created the target. It is still a text. I will go to the properties here, to the object data properties of the text while selected, and go to geometry and extrude it a bit just to make it easier to be selected. And I will add some bevel. So depth 0.01 looks good. Okay, that's it. Just go back to... There are multiple ways to go to top orthographic view. One of them is to press 7 on in the numpad, but in case you don't have a numpad, just press this Z here in the gizmo, and it will do the same thing. So just make sure that it will be always overlapping the 5. Okay. And in case you cannot see this gizmo here, it's not visible, click here and enable navigate. Okay. Now, before we continue, let's copy this target here somewhere away and Shift D X to copy it on X, and then I'll press Shift R to repeat this in order to have 5 numbers. Now this I will make it 4, and I will repeat the operation for the rest of the numbers. Okay. Now this will be our target that we will switch later to each one of these numbers using animation nodes. But first, I will take some time to rename. So this I will call target. Okay. This I will just call it F2. I will call it 5. And F2 4. F2 3. F2 2. And 1. And I'll put all these here in the outliner in a new collection. So M, new collection, and I will call it numbers. They all moved inside this collection here, just to keep things organized. Now it's time to apply the Shrinkwrap modifier to the plane itself. I'll select the plane and go to the modifiers properties and add a new modifier, Shrinkwrap. Okay, and again this will go after the particles modifier here. So I will just grab it and take it up. So it's under the subdivision and above the particle system. Shrinkwrap is a great modifier, but as with most things, it has its own limitations, which is I cannot pick the target here. See, it's not even in the list because the target is a text, and what we need here is a mesh object. So I'll just click on the target and go to Object and Convert Mesh. Now, before I click this, notice here I added a shortcut because I do that a lot. So Alt-C will convert this target to mesh. And if I press Tab now, instead of going into the text edit mode, we will go to the mesh edit mode because this is a mesh object now. If you don't have this, by default, you wouldn't have this Shift Alt-C, sorry, as the shortcut. So you can just right-click. I remove the shortcut for now. So you will have it like this. So right-click on it, assign shortcut, and press Alt-C. And here you go. You have Alt-C assigned to mesh. And whenever you use Alt-C here in the viewport, you will have this small menu where you can change it to curve or grease pencil if you want to. So now I'll just make sure that the plane is selected and choose the target here, which is the text. This is not what I'm looking for. It brought all the vertices of the plane and mapped them to the target. So what we need actually here is to go to Shrinkwrap and choose Project. This is what we're looking for. But before I continue, I will just click on this and rename it to target. So this is our target now. Okay, and now if I go to 7 to top view and rotate, you'll see that maybe if I sit in the perspective, it's better. So I press R to rotate and Z to restrict the rotation on the Z axis and rotate. See, the mesh of the plane is following the target of the Shrinkwrap modifier, and so does the particle system. Okay, but it is sharp and cranky, and this is not the effect that I'm looking for. So I will add another modifier to solve this issue, and this will be the smooth modifier. And remember to bring it above the particle system. And here I will manipulate the factor to give me the result I'm looking for. And maybe make it 2 repeats. We can go back later and tweak these 2 values in order to get what we're looking for. So what's left now is to animate the plane, meaning like add keyframes to its rotation, animate the target, and alternate the target to use each one of these numbers in the animation. So first, let's animate the plane. So I press 7 again to go to top view. And I will press N while the mouse is over the 3D viewport. Press N to bring this menu here. Go to item. And on rotation under Z, I will, while hovering over the Z, I right click and insert single keyframe. Now we could have just put the mouse here and press I, but I will add keyframes to all 3 axes. We don't need this. So I'll Control Z to undo this. And now we have a keyframe here, you can see in the timeline. Flip to top. Okay, we have a keyframe here at keyframe 1. And Blender by default, whenever you start a new file, you will have start of the animation at frame 1, the end of animation at frame 250. And this here will show you where is the playhead at the moment. So for this animation, I'm going to animate from 1 till 300. So now we have this animation from 1 to 300. I created already a keyframe at frame 1. So I will go to top view again by pressing 7 on the numpad and press R. And I rotate it for 90 degrees. So I just press R and 90. And because we're in the top view, we don't have to specify Z because it's rotating to the view. So right click and no, sorry, we have to go first to the keyframe. Otherwise we will overwrite this one. So while here, I rotate again because it snapped back. Okay, and I write 90. And you'll not see it's minus 90 because when I rotated, I moved the mouse clockwise. And this here is considered minus, the opposite direction. Okay, so I will right click and insert single keyframe again. And now we have animation assigned to our plane from frame 1 till frame 60. Animation of 90 degrees. But we have an issue here. So if I go back and press play, it's animating. At frame 60, it stops animating. And you can notice also this smooth or ease animation we're going through. So it starts slow, then it goes faster, then it slows back again. And what we need is a constant animation that keeps going. So I can just go here and add a keyframe at each point to make it continue. But we will not get rid this way of the ease effect, and it's too much labor for my taste. So what I will do instead is go to, while the player of course is selected, I'll go to animation, preset, okay, and here I will just change this to graph editor. by default this should be at the top. Okay, so we have our graph editor here, and we have our emitter selected, and we have the object transform because we already have keyframes at the Z rotation. And here's our keyframe at frame 1, and then it goes all the way. Oh, I'm not going to do that. I'll just press Control, middle mouse button, and move it down to zoom it on the y-axis. Okay, so now these are our keyframes. So it's going from rotation 0 at frame 1 to rotation minus 90 at frame 60. Okay, and see this Bezier curve here. This is what's causing the easing animation. So while the curve is going on here, we go like smoothly increasing speed, then it goes straight with constant speed, then it eases back again until it's like stops slowly. So what I will do to counter that is press A to select, or just select both the keyframes like this. I'll press Shift E and choose linear extrapolation. So what happened when I did that? Well, you see that this animation line went from like eternity into eternity. It's like it's like a vector now. Okay, it's not like it's ending somewhere. And both these keyframes, these handles now are on the same line. So let's bring this by press Shift left arrow to bring the playhead to the frame 1, to the first frame, and press space. And now we have a constant rotation animation that doesn't stop, and it will keep going until we reach frame 300 and goes back to frame 1 because this is the length of our animation. Now, in order to make this goes faster, I can bring this keyframes here from 60 to 40, for instance, which will make it go faster because now it's steeper here. If you notice what happened, see what happened here. So now, before it was going from 0 to 90 minus 90 degrees in 60 frames. Now it's going from 0 to 90 degrees in 40 frames only. So of course this will make it play faster. And for the extrapolation, if you don't have the shortcut, Shift E, it is the shortcut by default, but if you don't have it for some reason, click here, go to Channel and Extrapolation Mode and choose Linear Extrapolation. And you can see here the shortcuts by default is Shift E. Okay? So now we have the animation ready for the plane. Now let's animate the target. So I select the target, we go back to the layout preset here, add more space. Okay, and I'll bring this to press G and Z and bring it down, but I don't want it to intersect with the plane because then it will be mapped on top of the file, which is not what we want. We just want to bring all the spheres back to 0. Okay, so this is one way to do it. Another way to do it is actually control the Shrinkwrap modifier itself. So here, if I go to Shrinkwrap modifier, you see I have an offset. So this is another way here. By animating this Shrinkwrap modifier here, the offset, I can achieve the same effect. But for now, let me just put this back to 0, which is automatic, and just do this by animating the target itself. So again, I will press Shift left arrow and go back to frame 1 and bring the target down. And if you want to move it very little, just press and hold Shift while moving. So just enough to bring them all down. And I will press N again, go to Item, right-click on the Z, and insert single keyframe. Now I will move the playhead to frame 40. But before I do that and start putting keyframes, let's do this first. We have 300 frames, which is 10 seconds if we're rendering with 30 frames per second. Now we have 5 numbers, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. So the duration for each animation, while the target is down, then goes up, then goes back, should be concluded within 60 frames. So we have 300 divided by 5, 60 frames. So each number should be down between 0 and 60, then 120, then 180, then 240, then 300. So let's do that. I'll just make sure this keyframe is selected and copy, Ctrl-C, Ctrl-V to paste it, and paste it here at 60. And I'll do the same. I'll go to frame 120 and Ctrl-V again. Then go to 180, Ctrl-V, Ctrl-V, okay. Then 240 and Ctrl-V. And at the end at 300 and Ctrl-V again. So we have now the down keyframe. Of course, now if you play it, nothing happens. It's all keyframes at the same position. But now I'll bring the playhead to 30 and press G, Z, and move our target up. Now you can experiment with this, but I think 0.5 is a good location. Now, if I move the playhead again or press play, this will be gone. So I need to assign a keyframe first. So I right-click here again and insert single keyframe. And you see that this filling that we had here is broken now, because now there is a change in the keyframe, while between these keyframes here, there is no change. Okay, this is what this filling here means. This. So now our target is moving from 1 to 30 frames, then to 60 frames, it's back again where it was. And I will do the same here. I will just select this up position keyframe, Ctrl-C, and move here to frame 90, Ctrl-V, to frame 150, Ctrl-V, to frame 210, Ctrl-V, and to frame 270, and Ctrl-V. And let's go back and play our animation. Everything is good. Now, I don't want it just to go from bottom up, then bottom again. I want it to maintain its position for a short period of time. So I will select this keyframe and move it G, X, and 5. So I will move it to frame, actually let's move it to frame 5, because 1 plus 5 will make it 6. Okay? And same here. I will move this keyframe GX minus 5, and I will copy it, Ctrl-C. So now it is at frame 25, and I take it to 35. Ctrl-V. And you can see here that we have this filling here, meaning that this is maintaining its position here. There is no change on this keyframe. So 1, it will remain down at this position here until frame 5. Then from frame 5 till frame 25, it will move up. From 25 till 35, 11 frames actually will remain there. Then it go back down, but then again I need to move this GX minus 5 frames to the left. So at frame 55, I want it back down. And I'll repeat this. So now I'm selecting this position, Shift D, and move it to frame 65. So what I will do instead now is like select all these keyframes. So I'm pressing Shift and selecting, and move them to X by minus 5. And now instead of copying them, I'll press Shift D. Instead of pressing Ctrl-C, I'll press Shift D, and I'll enter 10 and enter. So I don't do them one by one, okay? And I will do the same for the other keyframes here for the position where the target is at the bottom. So I press GX minus 5, then Shift D, 10. So for 10 frames, or for 11 frames actually, because this is included, it will stay down. Then from 125, let's say, to 145 will go up, so 20 frames going up, and then it stays there for 11 frames, then goes down again and stays there for 11 frames, and this continues. We don't need this keyframe actually at the end here, so I'll just delete it. And now we have the animation of the target. Let's just play this a bit. Okay, cool. Let me just turn off the target here in the viewport. Yeah. Looks good so far. Okay. Let me bring it back. So now what we need to do next is to alternate this target. So we don't want 5 coming up every time. It's a countdown animation, right? So this is what we will do next. Before we continue, let's add animation nodes add-on. So go to Edit, Preferences, Add-ons, and make sure to search for it first, animation nodes. It won't be most probably available because it doesn't come bundled within Blender. So you can just go to your browser to animation-nodes.com and download it. If you scroll down here, you can find previous versions and different OS versions. So after you download it, you don't need to unzip it. You just go to back to Blender Preferences, Add-ons, and Install. Navigate to where you have it, install the add-on, and you will have it available. So you just tick this checkbox, and then that's it. You have already animation nodes. Right now, I'm using version 2.2.2. If you notice later that you're using a different version that doesn't have some of the nodes I'm using, or they have different names, it could be useful to go back and download this specific version to follow up with the tutorial properly. So I will just close this Blender Preferences window, and I will create a new region here. So I'll just position my mouse at the top right corner of the 3D viewport, click and drag, and change this editor type into animation nodes. Press N to hide this. And I'll scroll here and create a new node tree. So the way I'm going to do this is to put all these numbers here in a list node. Then I will use the frames here to pick each one of the numbers from this list node and assign it as the object data to this target here. So first of all, I would like to take a moment to explain the difference between what an object and what object data is. If you don't know this, this is crucial to continue with this project. If you already know, please feel free to skip this part. So when I select an object here, and this is our target, and you see the name here is target. If I scroll down here to show this all these types of properties, if I hover here, this is the object properties, and this has all the properties of the object that's called target. But here also we have object data properties, and if I click it, you will notice that this target isn't called target, it's called text.001, because when we renamed the object, we renamed the name of the object, not the name of the data of the object. So think of an object in Blender as a container that holds data. And this data can be different things. Can be many meshes, or can be one mesh, or can be a text. But in this case, this will look like what you see here. This is a text object, while this is, if you remember, we already converted it to a mesh object. Now, I can rename this here into target data. Now, why is this important? Because while this is the object object data that we're using for this object, that doesn't mean that this should always be the case. I can change this into a sphere, which is now the same object as this sphere, or the same object data. So these are two different objects that share the same object data now. And here you see this number 2 beside the name of the object data. That means that this object data is assigned to two objects. Now, if I bring this, after selecting this target again, if I bring it back to target data, and notice here this 0, this means that this target data is now orphan. It has no, it's not assigned to any object. So let's fix that and bring it back here. So this is how we're going to do this. These numbers here, we're going to alternate the object data of the target here in order to choose each one of them along the timeline here. Okay, so whenever, as we mentioned, whenever it goes up, it will say 5. Whenever it goes down here at frame 60, I want this object data to switch into number 4 instead of number 5. But first, before we do that, and before we jump into animation nodes and start adding our nodes, we cannot assign here, if you notice, if I click on this drop-down menu here within object data, we cannot pick these numbers because remember, these are still text objects, not mesh objects. So to fix that, let's just select them all and Alt-C and make sure they are converted to mesh. Now, if I select the target again and go to the object data, I can select each one of these object datas. Now you notice that the names are still default names, not the names that we renamed here, because again, when we pressed F2 previously, we actually renamed the objects, not their data. So let's do that now. I will select number 5 here, and I will call it 5.data. And I will do the same for each one of these. So 4.data. And instead, I'll just choose it here. I have to 2.data and 1.data. Okay. So now in animation nodes, I will press Shift A and add a list. Actually, I will add an object list. Create object list. Just zoom in into it to see the node. Now I will select, we want to make a countdown, so it's 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And I will select 5 and click on this eyedropper icon here to the right, not the other one. And this will assign it to the first object in the list. Then I'll click 4, select 4, and click this one here. And now we need 3 more inputs, so click this 3 times and repeat the same for each one of the numbers we have. And now we have our list ready. Now, before I continue, if you notice this number here playing in milliseconds, press N and go to node tree and disable this always. This is the refresh, okay? So when you have always selected or checked, the auto execution is running all the time. So just to save your computer some resources, it's better to turn it off and enable these 3 instead. So on tree change, whenever you change anything here, you add a new node, this will be auto executed. So you'll see the results directly. On frame change, so whenever you change the frame, also this will refresh. And on property change, so whenever you change the value here, it will also auto execute. So yeah, I prefer to have it set up this way. This is more resources friendly. And press N again to hide this menu. Okay, now let's get the info of the frame. What frame are we at right now? So here on animation nodes, I press Shift A and search for time info. And let's add a viewer node to see the results, the output of this time info. So Shift A, go to viewer, choose viewer, and link this frame to this node here. And see here, it says we are on frame 2, right? And here it says also we are on frame 2. So if you notice, we are just basically, this node is just outputting what frame is it at the moment. So delete this. And now we need to find a way to pick each one of these objects in this list at the specific frame. So now at frame 1, we want it to stay at frame at the object data. We need to stay at 5, this one. And at frame 60, we needed to switch to object 4. Same at frame 120. So when the target object is down, it will make the switch, and 180 and 240. So we don't need any switch after that because it will be 1. At 240, it will switch to 1, and that's the end of our animation. And then again, it will just go back to 5 and loop. So I created this little illustration here to talk about lists in Python before we continue on with our project. So here we see a list that's populated with 100 items, okay, from first item to 100th item. But the index of this list goes from 0 to 99. First item is at index 0 and 100th item is at index 99 because 0 counts here. This might be confusing a little bit in the beginning if you think about, well, second item is at index 1, not in index 2. But just keep this in mind because this will help us a lot with our project. Okay? So here in our list of objects, we have these 5 items, but the index here, which we cannot see right now, goes from 0 to 4. So 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, regardless of what items are listed. Okay? Now I press Shift A and get list element. I will add this node here. And you see this get list element has a list that you can attach. This is our list. And it has an index. So if I press this here, this is what we need to change actually. Of course, you will not see it here. We haven't assigned it yet to the target. But index 0 is will be outputting the element, the first element, which is this element, okay? And element 1, index 1, will be outputting the second element, and so on and so forth. Now we need to find a way to get the frames info here and make it do this change for us. Now press Shift A, go to animation, animate float. And I will input this frame into the time, Okay. Now the duration, if you remember, we said that we will be flipping, we will be making these switches between numbers until frame 240, because 240 will be the last switch from number 2 to number 1. So this is the duration we need here, 240. Start value will be 0. This will output the index. So start value will be 0 and end value will be 4. Okay? And now we will take the result and hook it to the index. So I will just add a viewer node just to make sure that we're on the right path, and link this element here to the viewer to see what we're getting. So here you see like 2 lines of code, but what we're interested in is this is object 1. The object, we called it 1. And we are at frame 240. But what happens if we go to frame 180? It's object 2. So let's go this from the beginning. I press shift left arrow and move this slowly. And I want you to watch this here, this value. Okay, so while I'm playing this playhead, at 60, at frame 60, it's switching to object 4. Object 4. And again, at frame 120, it switches to object 3. Same with frame 180, switches to 2, and frame 240 switches to 1 and remains at 1, which is exactly what we need here. So what's left to do here is to add a way to link this result, this object coming from here, into the target, our target. So I'll press Shift A, and here I will choose object data and choose here copy object data. So here in this node we have copy object data from and to. To, we know that we need to copy it to the target. And from is what we will get from this element, from this get list element. So I will link this here and play the animation, press space, and it's working. Well, exactly where we want it to happen, it's making the switch. So at frames 60, at frames 120, at frames 180, and at frame 240. So that's it for animation nodes. This is what we need to do in animation nodes for this project. Next, we will be talking about the material for the particle system, for the spheres, in order to make them transparent, fully transparent while they are on the floor, and only start to show and emit when they go up, and control their color and the strength of emission. Before proceeding with adding material to the particle system, or let's say to the instancer of the particle system, I would like to take a moment to demonstrate how this works in a new scene. So I just come here, and you don't have to follow along this. This is just for a demonstration. So I will create a new scene, and let me collapse this. So I right click on the divider, join area, move to the right, which is I don't need anymore, and left click. Okay, I'll press Shift A and add a new UV sphere here. And right click and shade smooth. And this new scene has nothing by default, so I will add light. So Shift A, light, and a point light would be fine. GZ, press 7, G, and I just realized that my screencast keys is turned off, so I turn it on again. Okay, and go to rendered mode. Let me first go to the shading actually. So here, go to the shading preset and press and hold Z and move the mouse up and release Z. This will take us to the render mode. Oh, it's pitch black. Okay, so I will select the light and go to the light settings here and put it to like 500. Okay, so here's our sphere. Actually, I'll also come here to the world, add a new world, and make the background a bit lighter. Yeah, that's it. So this sphere, this new sphere I just created, right now doesn't have any material. So while selected, I will go to the material properties and click on new. And in the material shader here, in the shader editor, sorry, you will have this new material, which is a principled BSDF shader assigned to the surface of a material output, these two nodes. So in order to control the color or any property of an object, depending on its position, I press N here on the 3D viewport to show that our object here is at 0, 0, 0. Okay, what we're interested in is the Z location. So I'll press in the shader editor, I'll press Shift A and go to input and bring the object info. So this object info has many links here, many properties: location, color, object index, material index, and just a random. What we're interested in is the location. So if I link this location here to the base color of the principled shader, we get this, which is not much actually. But if we move the object up, so GZ, look what happens. It's turning blue because blue is the color of the Z index. Let's put it this way. So XYZ, put it RGB. So if I move it on the X axis, GX, it will turn red. If I move it on the Y, GY, it will turn green. Okay? So what we're interested in is the Z axis actually. And the reason, before I continue, the reason it's black because it's 0 on all axes. So there is like no information or 0 information, let's say. So when I move it up GZ, it's getting, notice the Z value here in the transform on the location, how it's increasing. And when it gets to 1 and beyond, okay, this will be full color at 1. Okay, so press escape to get it back to its location. What we are interested in here is the Z location. So I press Shift A and go to converter and separate XYZ. And just put it here over this noodle and left click and it will link it. But here it uses the X axis. What we need is the Z axis. And now it's back black again. If I press G and Z and move it up, it turns white. Because what we got here is that we took the information from the object location and we took only the Z. So Z now will go from 0 to 1 and output it to the color here. So our object here, let's say our object goes only from 0 to half, 0.5. Okay, it will never get full white. Okay, it will remain at 50% gray. So how to tackle this? Well, I will add my favorite node ever at converter color ramp and just drop it here. So this gives me a range from white to black. And when I move this up at 0.5, it's still the same, it's still giving me gray. But if I move this color here, back left, and put it at 0.5, for instance, and this object here is at 0.5 exactly on the Z-axis, this is now white. And notice the difference here. So it mapped actually the value that's coming out of Z from 0 to 1 is from black to white. And now we can control that, okay, give me white at 50%, not at 1%, not at 100%. And we can do the same for the black also. So let me put this at 0 again, and move it up slowly. I'll hold shift and see it's not moving much, but when it surpasses this edge, it turns slowly into white. Now, let me just bring this to demonstrate it even better. Bring this black here, too close to the white. So I'll use the numbers. I'll just make sure it's selected and press 0.49 and click the white and 0.51. So too close together, okay? And I'll move this on the Z-axis again. So G, then Z, and hold shift and move up. And yes, see, it almost immediately changes from black to white. From until 0.4 and check the Z location. Until 0.48, it's still black, pitch black. Then at 0.49, which is where the location of this black color on the color map node, it started changing into white until I reached the 0.51, and now that's it. It doesn't change anymore. Okay, so the color ramp gives us the opportunity to control the value coming from the Z and output it to our shader, or even directly to the surface if you want. Okay. Now, for our, I'll just go back here to our file, to our scene. This is the method I'm going to use to control the value of the emission, strength and color of these particles, and I will control also the position, the location where they will be fully transparent. Okay, so I'll select the instance object, the sphere. Our sphere is, because it is being used as an instance object, this is what these spheres here will be using for material. So here, just make sure that we are in rendered viewport shading. Okay, and I will select the sphere, make sure I'm still in the material properties, and give it a new material. And I will call this material particles material. Okay, now if I change this color to red, all these particles here will follow along the instance. So turn it back to white. Now, I'm not going to use principled. I don't need shading here. It's up to you actually to use shading or use emission, as I'm going to do. But for this example, I will be using an emission shader. So I will just click this node and press Shift S and go to shader and change this shader into emission shader. Now, if Shift S didn't do this for you, that means you don't have Node Wrangler add-on enabled. So in this case, go to Edit, Preferences, Add-ons, and search for Node Wrangler. And Node Wrangler comes bundled within Blender, so you don't have to download anything. You just need to tick this checkbox in order to make it enabled. Okay. Now, there are many useful shortcuts in Node Wrangler add-on. So Shift S is one of them. Whenever I'm selecting a shader or any node and press Shift S, this allows me to replace it rather than delete it and create a new one with Shift A. Okay, so this is one of these useful shortcuts. So now I have an emission shader. Strength is 1, color is white, fully white. See here now RGB. Okay, and now I will repeat what we did in our scene here. Actually, let me try to do this. I'll just select these three since I already created them. Control C, go back here, and Control V. And I will link this color to the color of the emission. And look what we have here. While the spheres at the 0 position on the z-axis, they are black, and they go gradually up until here. But see, this here is at 0.8, while these spheres here are lower, because if you remember, if I enable the target now, and the position of the target is at 0.4 actually here. So I'll select the sphere again to be able to edit the shader and bring this white into the left and watch the viewport here, what's going on. Okay, so let's put that at 0.5. And now I can control where to start the transition. So I can take this to the right or keep it to the left. And I can change this method here. So this is linear transition. I can put it as a B-spline. And B-spline is like more of an easing. Actually, there is an ease here. But B-spline is more of a very smooth transition. So I can take this black a little bit to the right now in order to make it fully black as zero. But the thing is, we don't need black actually. What we need is transparent. So how to do that? What I will do is press Shift A to add a new shader, come to shader, and come to transparent, and add it here. Make sure this color is fully white. So come here to RGB and make sure these all are at 1. Now, the color picker here, I have this one which is not the default. So this is what I prefer actually. I believe this is called HS and V. So hue saturation here. No, actually it's HV plus SV plus H. Sorry, SV plus H. So saturation and value here, and the hue is this one here. Okay, now you can choose the method that you like for the color picker. You just go to edit, preferences, go to interface, and under editors, color picker type, just choose the one you prefer. By default, I believe it is Circle HSV. So let's check this out. This is Circle HSV. Okay, I don't feel comfortable, to be honest, picking the color here. I don't feel that I have too much control. So this is just my preference. You can choose the method that you feel comfortable using. Okay, there are many ways to use this. So mine is just square SV plus H. Okay, and now I know why all my headers are going on the bottom. When did I change that? I don't actually remember doing that. Anyways, so now we have a transparent shader and we have an emission shader. Now the transparent shader is still free. It's not giving any effect because it's not linked to anything. So with Wrangler nodes add-on available, I can just hover my mouse here, press Ctrl Shift, right click and hold the right mouse button and drag it over the other shader. And let go, and this will create automatically a mix shader. So again, I'll just delete this with Ctrl X and just hover here and create the mix shader. Now, if for some reason you don't like to use Node Wrangler, which is highly recommended, but if you don't want to use it, or if you just want to do it the traditional way, just press Shift A, go to Converter, and go to choose here shader. No, not shader, to RGB. Actually, go to shader, sorry. Yeah, I don't remember where they are. Mix shader, put it here, and link the other shader. So this is doing the same thing, but I find it much easier to do it the Node Wrangler way. So now this mix shader is mixing these both shaders, which is transparent and emission, 50 by 50-50. Okay, so instead of using this for the color of the emission, I will use it as a factor. And this should make these guys here that are at position 0 use the upper shader, and the spheres that are at a higher position on Z will use the bottom. White will output 1 as a value, and in a mixed shader, the top part is 0 and the bottom part is 1, and everything in between is a mix of both of them. So what we need actually is the opposite. I need this to be linked here at the bottom and this to be linked at the top. So here's our emission and here's our transparent shader. Now you see here that we do not have actually transparency. We have black again. So I'll just go here to render properties, and yes, I'm using EV. We can have transparent in EV, but I will not go through this because actually we'll be using cycles. So I'll just switch here to cycles and GPU and check this out. Now maybe the plane will not allow us to see much. So what I'm going to do here is to select this plane and go to the particle properties and scroll down to render and tick off this show emitter. And this will not hide it in the viewport. This will hide it only when we render. So for the viewport, the solution is to give the plane or the emitter here a material and make the shader fully transparent. So go to shader here, transparent, and make it fully white. Okay, so all values are 1, and this will hide it in the viewport. So you see the spheres here, how they're going. See this transition. I reselect the sphere target, the sphere object, sorry. And here now you can control where you want this transition to start and where to end. So you can make it too steep, but this won't work much with B-spline. So let's go back to linear. You can make the transition steeper or easier, smoother. Okay, it's up to you actually. Now, we use this as a factor to mix between transparency and emission, but we can use it for many things. So let me bring this here. Now, I will press Shift A and choose another code converter and another color ramp. I'll put it here and select this color. I don't want it black. I'll choose red to white. And I will use this here as a factor for this other color ramp and use this as the color for the emission. So now it is going to change the color of the emission from red to white. But again, I need to control this, bring it to the left to make it whiter. Okay, and this here also I'll bring it to the left more. I'll take this back to B-spline, give it more of a transition space. And here we change the color. So I will just tweak it a bit to get, I'd like to have these particles at the top to be white and everything else gradually fading to red. Now to the strength of the emission, I will try to bring this value here and hook it to the strength. So see here, the red spheres are less emissive than the top ones. But I would like to have even more control on that, because I noticed that some of the spheres at the top are becoming a bit transparent, or actually are becoming not fully emitted. So I will create another color ramp node here, link this value to it, and link this color here to this strength, and tweak this. Now, this is outputting the highest value of this color is outputting is 1. Why? Because the values here under RGB is 1, 1, 1. So I can even give it more. Well, in emission shader, we can make it not only one emissive. We can make it like 10, if you like. This is like turning up a light and make it even stronger, a wattage, let's say. Okay? And this spheres, later on, I will be creating a background plane with a reddish dark color. And I want these spheres to be emitting, to be lighting as the light source of the plane itself. So I need a stronger light to do that. So we can do that, but if we want to control it through the color ramp here, what I will do is I will make sure that this white here is selected, click on the color, and click and drag these 3 values here, and I can change them all at once by, let's say, 5, and enter, and this will be as if I am typing 5 here in the string. But here also I have the areas where it is black, it's not emissive at all. Okay? And I'll choose, let's try ease here. Now let's create the background. So I press Shift A, plane. I will move it a little bit down. So G, Z, just a little bit, tiny bit. And press S5. So scale it 5 times, then confirm with enter. And I notice here we have a lamp. So I'll just click it and delete it. And now the only source of light for us here are these spheres. So I go back to the layout preset here and press and hold Z, move my mouse up and release Z to go to render view, or just from solid here, you can go to render view from here. So now I will select the bottom plane and I will rename it to floor. And I will give it a material. So I'll go to material properties and click new. I'll keep this as a principled BSDF and change the color here to some dark red. Now I will tweak it a bit, so I will reselect the sphere and perhaps bring this red color here more to the right, so only the top ones will be fully white. This to the right a bit. Okay, yeah, I like it this way. So I go back again to the layout and change this here to check it out. So while the number is emerging, it will be fully red. Then gradually it will turn white at the top part of the circles. The circles at the top will turn white, and it will light the scene. Then when it's going back, same thing will be repeated. But all the time, this number will be shaped by these spheres going up and down because the plane at the bottom is rotating. And when it's down, there is no light source. So just make sure that you have a word. So if you don't have a word here, to be pitch black. So click new and make sure it's not black and it's not white either, because then you won't have too much of a light effect. So just somewhere in the middle here, just to see the effect when the spheres are lighting up the scene. Now I will select the floor again, go to shading preset, and I will give it some, I will reduce the roughness a little bit so see some reflection on it. Let's try this out. So put it maybe to 0.2. And let's check it out now. See, we have some reflection. But I'm going to be rendering at this angle, probably. Here. Yeah, it looks good. Maybe 0.3, maybe 0.2 is too much. 0.3. Now, let's move to the camera, because this is what will be rendered. So if I render right now behind this by pressing M, if I render right now, this is what we will have, which is definitely not what I want as a final result. So I'll select my camera, or I can select it here. And sometimes you might be having like weird things, like this is not your camera, or you created another camera by mistake. Just make sure here to go to the scene properties and check that you're using the camera that you're manipulating. So now I am in camera perspective. And to do that, I just toggle with the 0 on the numpad. Now, if I rotate here, I will snap back to user perspective, and my camera will be left alone here. So to fix this, I will press N and go to View and enable the locking under View Lock, enable the lock of the camera to view. Now I can just orbit, as I do usually in perspective view, and position my camera wherever I need it to be. Now, after I position my camera, I'll press N and unlock this, because I don't want to animate to change the position of my camera by mistake later. So in order to do this, I usually use a shortcut. So I'll assign a shortcut and I use Ctrl-Alt-V. So now I can toggle this by just pressing Ctrl-Alt-V. So now when this is off, I won't be moving my camera by mistake. And if I want to do so, I just press Ctrl-Alt-V without going here to the panels and just move it or orbit it or position it however I like. Now, I go back to the layout here and press 0 on my numpad to go to the camera perspective and check that all the numbers are nicely centered and nothing will be cropped when I finally render this. Looks like everything is fine. And let me test this in the solid view. So I'll press and hold Z and move my mouse to the right and release the Z. Here I noticed that a part of the number 2 is being not overlapped by our plane. It's not crucial because it's at the edge and it's the lower parts. But I prefer to fix this before I go to render the animation. So I will enable this target here in the viewport. I will press 0 to exit the camera view, press 7 to go to the top view, and select the target and scale it just a tiny bit down, and then move it again to the center of the plane. So let's test this out. 4 here, let's see. No, it's fine. It's fine. 7. 5 is good. 4, 3, 2 is good now. And 1 is good also. So now we're sure that nothing will be surprising us later when we render the final animation. I'll press 0 again and press Z, rendered, and hide this target in the viewport again. The numbers look, when they are fully extended, they look a little bit more on the upper side of the frame. So I will just press Shift. I need to press Ctrl-Alt-V again and position this a little bit down here. And now we are ready to go to make our final render for the animation. But before I do that, I like to take some time and render single shots at different positions just to test my lighting and test that everything is fine. So I don't have any surprises later when I leave it to render for 3 or 4 hours. Remember, we're using cycles here, and this will take some time. And I will also enable denoising. So here on the render properties, I will click on denoising. I will enable the render denoising. I don't need to render to denoise in the viewport. And go back here in the viewport to the solid mode and press F12. See what I'm talking about? I forgot to turn off the target in the render. So I'll press escape, and I should turn this here off. Now, if you don't see this icons here, the cameras, or if you don't see the eye icon, this eye will hide the object in the viewport, while this will hide it in the render. It will make it unrenderable, say. So if you do not see these icons here, press here on the filter and enable this icon. So we have the selection icon, which is make it non-selectable if we disable it. So let's enable this, for instance. I will make the target visible in the viewport, but not selectable. So now I cannot select the target anymore. This is very useful if you don't want to select and move something by mistake. Okay, so something you put it in the right place, you don't want to change its place anymore. For instance, the plane, we don't want to change its position anymore, so I disable this. And now I won't be able to select it by mistake and move it. Same goes for the floor, we have it in place, even the camera. Okay, and our sphere doesn't matter actually. So I just disabled everything. And the numbers, okay. So yeah, now I just disabled everything. Anyways, let's back to what I'm talking about. So now at the target, I can actually keep it visible in the viewport, and just by disabling this here, I can press F12 and it won't show in the render. Yeah. Another thing I forgot to do before the final render, which is adding the motion blur. So I'll press escape. And here under the render properties, I will scroll down and enable motion blur. Now you can expand this if you want to tweak these values, but for now I'll just use the default. So let me try it. And this is the effect here for the spheres that are moving faster than the others are getting a longer trail. While the spheres that are not much moving, they will be like sharper. Now, if I increase this value here, the shutter, I will set it to 0.8, we should have an even longer trail. For me, I think I will stick to the 0.5. Now, before I press Ctrl F12 and go to fully render the animation, I need to set up a few things. So, as I said, let's just go, for instance, here and check this frame. Check the lighting, check that you like the lighting, that everything is good. You don't have any problems, things left black, for instance, by mistake. For instance, let me put this transparency here at 6. Default it is 8, but let me just try this. So I press F12, and look what we have here. All these spheres at the bottom, they look like this grayish black thing. Okay, and this is because we don't have enough on the transparency, enough bounces on the transparency level. Okay, so 12 usually works good for this scene. Okay, so once you rendered few frames at different areas and you made sure that there are no surprises in the results you're expecting, it's time to make the final animation, to render the final animation. So let's go here to the output properties. Make sure that our frame start and frame end are what we're expecting. These are what we have here actually. Now frame rate, I want this to be 30 frames per second, but it really doesn't matter because eventually I will not be rendering to FFmpeg, to AVI for instance, or FFmpeg. I will not render to a video file directly. And this is very important because if I render to a video file directly and something goes wrong, a crash, out of memory, the battery is dead, whatever, I will lose every single render I made. Well, what I will do is I will render to JPEG sequence. And let's say that I start rendering and for some reason it started at frame 1 and it rendered until frame 80 and something happened while I am away. I won't lose these 80 frames. I can just go here to 81 and continue rendering from frame 81. And when it's done, I will get all my animation ready. So my advice is to use always a sequence render. Now we need to tell it where to save the file, of course. So just click this here and tell it where to save this file. And I will name it Countdown Motion Graphics. And leave it this here because when it's rendering as a sequence, it will be adding the 0001 or 001 here after this underscore. So I like this naming convention. So now we told already Blender where to save it. And we are rendering a sequence. And now I'm ready to press Ctrl F12. Now, when I do that, usually, even that I tested before I started, I don't like to just leave the computer and run. I like to watch the first few renders here. And look what happened now. Now I have frame 0 rendering. I don't know where this came from. It is, I changed it by mistake to frame 0. So I put it to frame 1. And press Shift left arrow and press Ctrl F12 again. And because here I have overwrite checked, so even if it already rendered few frames, it will be overriding them now. So Ctrl F12. And again, I noticed a problem here. So these circles here, these spheres, sorry, not circles, are not fully transparent here. Okay, so they are not fully on the Z position that we need. So I can tackle this by going again, selecting the sphere, going to the shading, and perhaps I need to take this black a little bit more to the right. So press F12 again. So the problem we had was at frame 1, and now it's gone. Almost gone, actually. I can see something here. Yeah, just a small trace. It's no big deal, but I'll even move it a little bit to the right. Test again. Yeah, that's perfect. So now I go back to solid mode. Ctrl F12. And if everything goes fine, I will come back when this is done. So now after almost 3.5 hours, the render is done. And this is what I got. Sequence of images. And now we need only to put it in a video. So I'll just go here to create a new scene, like what we did before. And I know I don't need anything here in this scene. I'll just keep it empty because we are going to be using the compositing. So I go to the compositing here and I press use nodes and Ctrl Shift click on this node here just to add it to the viewer, but actually we don't need render layers. So I'll press X to delete this node, press Shift A. What we need is to go to input and bring an image sequence node. And once we click it, we just need to navigate to where we saved our sequence of images previously. Press A to select all and import image sequence. And here it is. So we have 300 frames. Start frame is frame 1, no offset, and auto refresh. We don't need to change anything here. Okay? I'll just link this image to the image of the composite here and link it to the viewer and press play. And I'll press V here down to zoom out the background image, which is being projected using the viewer here. So we will re-render this now, and this time we will use a video format for rendering. So I'll come here to the output properties and change this PNG sequence to a FFmpeg video. You can use AVI, JPEG or RAW, but I prefer to use the FFmpeg. Now, for the encoding, you can use Matroska, which will give you an MKV file, or you can use MPEG-4. I'll just stick to Matroska. You can use any of these, actually. You have QuickTime, AVI, Flash, or WebM. Yeah, I prefer Matroska, to be honest. And quality, I will use the lossless quality. I want it to be as good as it gets. Encoding speed, well, the slowest is the better. Okay, it will take a bit more time, but actually this process here, the render here, will be too fast, relatively. So this here will it will add 30 seconds or 1 minute. It doesn't matter, we'll get a better quality. Now, important here to notice that this is the default value for the frame start and frame end. So we need to put 300 here because our sequence is 300 frames. And now here it matters to put this frame rate to 30. I want it to be 30 frames per second. So it's up to you to choose the frame rate you prefer. And of course, we need to tell it where to save the file. So we click here and we just give it a name wherever we want to save it. So I will just call it final countdown tutorial, and that's it. Now if I press Ctrl F12, sorry, see how fast this is? Nothing compared to the cycles, but of course we're here just combining a sequence of images in a video file, so there is no much processing power needed. And this is, I'm using the slowest encoding method, which is the best at the same time. Yep, it's done now. So if I now go to where I saved this file, here it is, double click, and MKV, it won't run smoothly in Windows Media Player for me, so I just right click and open it with, and VLC Media Player, and here it is. So this concludes our tutorial. Thank you for watching, and I hope you found some useful information in this tutorial. Please let me know in the comments what you liked, what you didn't like, so I can improve for the next tutorials that I'm planning to make. I use your comments in order to provide a better quality tutorials and more engaging. Thank you very much. Take care.